So how is your karma these days? No, I've not taken a turn to the Hindu or the Buddhist. In many ways, their understanding of karma is so different than anything we would even begin to talk about. But, as you know, it is solid church teaching that all religions have a piece of the truth, or a new take on the truth, or new words for old truths that refresh them for us. Many scholars assume Jesus knew something of the thinking of the East. After all, he lived in the Middle East. And that by definition, the Middle East is the crossroads between the East and the West. He lived his life right there. And knowing Jesus, his search for truth and figuring out who he was and what his calling was to be, he talked to everybody, just like when he wandered off into the temple at the age of 12, engaging the rabbis with all of his questions in his search for himself and the meaning of life and who God is. They were impressed. This gospel, these are all random sayings of Jesus that were heard and written down over the ages. It seems nothing is really holding them together at first blush, but sitting with them for a bit, what I hear loud and clear, the one thing holding them all together is what some might call karma, or, as Jesus put it, you reap what you sow, or what goes around comes around, or how you give is how you get. Or, in other words, God will not be outdone in generosity. Not that God's generosity is dependent on yours. We would be in trouble. But still, in our being generous, something opens up in us to the generosity of God, and we come to know it. In the first reading, you heard about the prophet Elisha passing through town, and this lady in town told her husband, I'd like to feed him dinner while he's here. And so she makes an offer for dinner, and Elisha comes over, and she proves this incredibly hospitable woman to him, and they enjoyed the conversation of dinner. So she invited him back again and again, and finally she said, do you have a place to live? And she talked to her husband, and they built a little room for him, an annex that they let him live in. They were so generous to him, so hospitable, that he wanted to know, how can I give them back something for all their kindness to me? I want to be kind too. I want to be generous too. I want to be hospitable too. And so he made his living place with them in that circle of things. And then if you noticed in the gospel, what goes around comes around. You get what you give. Whoever receives you receives me. Whoever receives a prophet because he is a prophet receives a prophet's reward, gets something of the prophet back in them. And whoever receives a righteous person, somebody who's trying to live a right, good life, gets a taste of that themselves and just being proximate to that, and ends up wanting to live that kind of life themselves and know the goodness of being with good people. And whoever gives only a cup of cold water to one of the little ones will not lose their reward. It's going to come back to them by somebody giving them that cup of cold water someday in one way or another along the way. What goes around comes around all the time. That's the truth. How you give is how you get. I was helped by one of our students in engineering who told me he had a metaphor for me to use someday, he said. A metaphor for love. a circuit. A circuit. In words even I could understand, he said, electricity only works in a circuit. It's not one way. It's got to be both ways. A circuit, he said, is a closed loop that electricity moves through. As long as it's a closed loop, it flows. But if you break the loop, the electricity no longer flows. A light switch. A light switch works by flicking the switch, and by flicking the switch up, the loop closes and the light comes on. And to flick that same switch down, you break the loop. And so the circuit is broken and the light turns off. And that's the point here in these scriptures we just heard proclaimed. It's how you give out that is how you will receive. It is why Jesus said at one point that if we do not forgive, we cannot be forgiven. The loop. If you don't forgive, you won't be forgiven. And in another place, forgive us our trespasses just as we forgive others their trespasses. The loop is closed and forgiveness happens for the giver and the receiver of forgiveness. People say to me, I'm sure you've heard it, you've probably felt it yourself, as have I, that they're not getting enough love. People think they're not getting enough love, or people think they're not getting enough respect, or no one pays any attention to them. And I have to say, they are invariably the same people who give out very little themselves, who give out little of that love themselves so they don't find it coming back to them. They don't give out the respect themselves, and so they're not getting it back. And they don't pay attention to other people, so people are not paying attention to them. Sorry to have to be so honest, but people who live in the full circuit, equally giving out and receiving, people who live in the full circuit will have gratitude and what one of my mentors called a foundational happiness. A foundational happiness. Oh, they'll have their moments when they'll be crabby and hurt and things like that will happen. But they are basically happy. People who give out the love are basically happy people and grateful on a daily basis. And if they're not, my guess is they're not living within that circuit. What goes around comes around. How I give out will be how I will receive. And if you're not getting a whole lot of love, I would bet you're not giving a whole lot of love yourself. Most of us can't see that. Most of us can't see that, but I'll bet you everybody else around us sees that. Most of us tend to think we are way more loving than we actually are. Delusional thinking. Most of us think we're a whole lot more loving than we really are. There is one journey, my friends, there is one journey that never ends. You and I can always grow in love. You and I can always grow more in love. We can always grow in our capacity to let the flow into us and out of us, equally into us and equally out of us. When there is that sort of balance, and we take in equally what we give out, let others love us, then there's that balance. Let others love me, and then let go of my ego and my fears so I can love them. we will find ourselves then inside of this wonderful, simple, and yet hard to find fundamental happiness to our lives. Love is to live inside the circuit, both giving and receiving. You can't just give, and you can't just receive. And it takes almost our whole life to learn that. When I close the loop, I get light. And so does the world.